everybody, and welcome to WTF Hammer Underworlds. Today's video is going to be a Season 2 warband balancing video looking at the Godsworn Hunt. And I just reviewed this warband and I'll be posting the link for that review in the description below. And in that review, anyway, I came to the following conclusions about this warband. That they have a very costly inspiring mechanic, and the common sense move is to tend to focus upgrades on a few units, which means that many units will end up going uninspired throughout the course of a match. They also have low wounds and a mediocre defense, which results in them being easy to take out of action, but they do compensate by having many units and good defensive ploys to help save some of their units. They also have a good combination of ranged attacks, and they have high movement, which means they can easily reach enemies and make attacks, and they're rewarded particularly for taking out enemy leaders, which is nice, since they're likely to be able to reach the enemy leader. And the final point here is that this warband really is just a jack of all trades. I mean, they can hold objectives, they can kill, they can do other kinds of positional play, but they are really a master of none. They have no push cards to make them great at holding objectives, and they're okay killers, but they're definitely not top tier aggro. So good at everything, or at least capable of doing everything, but definitely not great at anything. And because of this, I rank this warband as a C, meaning that I'm going to be making recommendations to buff this warband. And as I always do, I'm going to be recommending some errata changes, that being things that could be introduced to the existing rules of this warband just to help give them a little buff, the buff that they definitely need, as well as introducing some new faction-specific cards that I'd recommend be printed out for this warband to help to bridge that gap and make them more competitive. And by starting at the errata, I'm going to be looking at this warband's fighter cards. I actually have some fighter card errata suggestions for this warband, specifically that all of these units, and I said except Grawl, but all these units basically get the Hunter keyword. And the reason I excluded Grawl is just that Skate's Wild Hunt excludes their animal as well, their tiger. So I figure the dog should be excluded for whatever reason it is that Games Workshop excluded that tiger from Skate's Wild Hunt. But anyway, my justification for this is that these guys are the Godsworn Hunt. I mean, even in their lore, they're described as being hunters, so it doesn't make a lot of sense to not make them hunters. It also would provide them with some good options, which would make them more jack of all trades-ish. Since they're kind of good at everything but not great at anything, having a hunter keyword would help make them even a little bit more versatile in that sense. Next, I'm going to be looking at some objective card errata, specifically that magical apotheosis be reworded so that any spell suffices. So the way this card typically works is that if Thedra casts a spell that has a cost of 2 or more, then as a surge she can get a glory point. And I think, it's already a little bit tricky to have her cast spells since she doesn't have a spell attack action. You have to put you have to put gambit spells specifically into your deck in order to pull this thing off. So casting spells requires including spells in the power deck, and also Thedra, uninspired, only has a spell level of 1. So she has to become inspired for this to even be reliable, so I don't see this as being abusive at all. It would just make this card more useful. Next, for objective card errata, I'd recommend that Dark Rewards be worth 2 glory points. So Dark Rewards gives you a glory point in an end phase if all of your units are inspired, which, as I've already described, is very difficult to do. So I think this should be worth 2 glory points. It would encourage actually trying to inspire all units, or tactically letting units die so that the only ones that remain are inspired. And it would also promote some versatility in deck building, in the sense that maybe people would vary the upgrades that they have in their deck to cover a wider range of units so that they can pull this thing off. And next, I have some power card errata suggestions, specifically that Writhing Charm, which I had ranked as a D, be reworded almost entirely so that it provides -1 damage against attacks. So normally, if an attack does specifically 1 damage, you can ignore it, and then you have a chance of just losing this card, which is pretty pathetic. So I'd recommend that it just be a flat -1 damage, but actually could reduce damage to a minimum of 0, which is very unique because no warband has a card like that, but then they still have a chance of losing this card as they would in the normal case. Justification is that the Godsworn Hunt lacks survivability, and this would provide them a nice little buff to survivability. And this iteration also makes this card unique, which is fun, and it would actually make it useful instead of just being left in the box when you're building a deck. So that does it for my errata suggestions. So just to summarize, for fighter card errata, just recommend that basically all units except for Grawl get the Hunter keyword. For objective card errata, I would reword Magical Apotheosis so that any spell suffices and would provide 2 glory points for successfully achieving Dark Rewards. And for power card errata, I would reword Writhing Charm so that it provides a -1 damage against attacks to a minimum of 0. So that does it for the errata. Now I'm going to take a look at the new faction-specific cards that I'd recommend. As I always do, I just kind of reiterate the manner in which I'd recommend that new faction cards be released, because you don't want to just release a whole bunch of new power or objective cards in some random number. There should be some structure to it, and the structure I recommend is one that would make Godsworn Hunt into a valid deck. That being a deck that has 12 objective cards and then 20 or more power cards, in which you have 10 gambits and 10 upgrades. We can have more upgrades than gambits, but not vice versa, blah, blah, blah. I've done this many times. Godsworn Hunt has only 10 objectives, although they have a valid power deck. So therefore, this warband should have 2 new useful objective cards so that they can be play out of the box, and also those cards should be useful in the sense that they help make this warband more balanced. So what are my suggestions then? Well, my first idea would be a card that rewards this warband's supporting mechanic. This warband has quite a few cards that encourage supporting in one way or the other, whether a unit counts as supporting when they're by themselves, or a double assist counts as a crit, or before an attack, Grawl moves to support. You know, they have a few things like that. So my recommendation would be a faction-specific Dead Cunnin, which would be called Fearless Pack, in which you score this immediately if a friendly fighter has 2 or more supporting fighters than their target when making an attack action. So it'd be a nice mechanic promoting swarming, and that's already made better by the existing ploys and upgrades that this warband has. So my justification is that it synergizes with the power cards, and it takes advantage of the large unit number and encourages aggression. And I always like to encourage aggression because passive games are not fun games. And finally, my second idea would be a card that provides effective passive glory, because this warband doesn't really score passive glory in any way. And it's not that I'm a fan of passive glory, but you know, if other warbands can do it, this warband should at least be able to, so that they're not left out of the equation. And my recommendation would be a faction-specific escalation called Boon for Glory. So those of you who are new to the game wouldn't know escalation. It was a Season 1 objective card that was restricted, that was in everybody's decks because it's a guarantee to be pulled off. You score this in an end phase if 3 or more upgrade cards were played in the preceding action phase, worth 2 glory points. And my justification is that this card would make thematic sense, considering that this warband requires equipping upgrades in order to become inspired, so it definitely fits. And it's also just a good card, which is needed for this warband. It'll help them. They're not very good. And that basically does it. So as you can see, my errata suggestions are summarized above. For new faction-specific cards, they need 2 new objective cards in order to have a valid deck, and I'd recommend a faction-specific Dead Cunnin, which could be called Fearless Pack, and a faction-specific Escalation, which could be called Boon of Glory. And that does it for my video. So if you guys have any thoughts or suggestions, please comment below. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video and you'd like me to make similar content. And next week, I'm going to be looking at Ilthari's Guardians. Have a nice day.